Hello there, lovely folks of YouTube. Ren here. I want to talk about this little herb next to me. Very commonly grown culinary herb. This is basil, garden basil or sweet basil. The Ocimum basilium is the binomial name of that one. This is a little different from another basil that you may see, which is holy basil or tulsi. That one is Ocimum tenufolium. So want to make that differentiation because sometimes some of the mythology and things that you see for basil are probably talking about tulsi and not this particular plant. So as I mentioned, this is a very, very widely grown culinary herb. It's used in numerous dishes, in numerous cultures, probably best known in Italian cuisine, which is of course part of my ancestry right there. So I want to mention the fresh basil is very distinctly different in flavor and character from the dried basil. It has a lot of aromatic compounds in it that are lost through the process of drying. So fresh basil tends to be a little bit more sharp and has some bite to it, whereas dried basil is very mellow and has a more sweet characteristic to it. Because of that, they really can't be substituted for each other. If you have a recipe that calls for dried basil, you can probably use fresh basil, but if you have a recipe that needs fresh basil, dried basil just isn't going to cut it. So better to have fresh. This plant is a very, very tender annual, okay? Even just a hint of cold and it will die on you like that. So you really need to start it every year. It's not going to overwinter for you. I have had seeds drop that will then sprout up the next year, but I've never had the actual plant survive. So you do need to start with a new plant every year, whether you start from seed or if you just buy pre-starts from your local greenhouse or what have you. Either way, you're going to need to start it. Ideally, you probably want to start the seed before the last frost, but you can't put these plants outside until well after the last frost, because any cold and they just they don't like it. So personally, last frost for me where I am is usually about mid-April. I usually wait until at least a week or two after that, so closer to the beginning of May before I really put these plants outside, just because even if I put them out, they'll survive, but they're not really going to thrive, you know. And it's usually not until the daytime temperatures get above 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 27 centigrade if you're using a non-backwards method of telling temperature. It's only when the temperatures hit that they really actually start to take off and actually put out growth. So this is an annual. It will flower readily on all of these stems. However, once it starts to flower, the leaves kind of start to get more astringent and bitter. So ideally, to keep your plant producing, you want to trim back every time it flowers. So this plant actually needs quite a bit of trimming. I hadn't gotten to it because rain, but I actually have my scissors here and I'm going to show you. Pruning this plant is actually beneficial to the plant because, there goes my notes, wherever you prune, you'll see these growths come out, and then there's two little stems on either side of where this stem grows out. So basically for every one that you prune back, right there, two are going to grow in its place. So the more you prune your basil, the more it's going to grow. And again, this is kind of not only increase the growth on the plant, but also keep it from going to seed and dying back, because once it fully sets these seeds, once these flowers turn brown and dry and the seeds come out of it, the whole plant is going to die because its purpose is served. It has fed the next generation. So definitely keep your basil pruned. Don't be afraid to do that. Grab my notes here. All right. So obviously, because these fresh leaves don't keep very long, and you can't put them in the fridge because that will kill them. They will just turn black and nasty. You pretty much need to use them right away or find some way to store them. Now personally, my personal favorite way of storing basil for long term is to make pesto genovese, and then I will freeze the pesto, but you can also just as easily just chop up your basil, put it in a little bit of olive oil, and then just freeze it, the basil with a little bit of olive oil around it, and that will work as well. I like to just make the pesto because that's like my 90% of my basil is used in pesto anyway. So, if you do want to dry this herb, it is possible, but You can't just hang the bundles to dry because it will just mildew. It has a very high moisture content in it. So you really need to use either a dehydrator, or personally, I don't have a dehydrator. What I use is I will actually dry it in the microwave. You just put the leaves on a paper towel in the microwave and you just kind of microwave them in like 10 to 15 second bursts. Just checking them every time, turning the leaves over as needed until they get nice and crispy. And that's how I dry my basil on the rare occasions that I do dry it for saving it. But like I said, most of it I'm using it fresh because I really prefer the flavor of the fresh basil. So let's talk about some of the mythology and magic behind this plant. So this plant is pretty widely considered to be have a fiery nature, just aligned with the fire element. Typically considered to be governed under the planet of Mars, which is under the rulership, particularly this plant being under the rulership of Scorpio in Mars. So with that in mind, obviously this is a really good plant for protection. Most fire-based plants are. It's also used in spells to bring courage. So that's, again, some of that fiery aspect there. So historically, there were two basic modes of belief on this plant, okay? And it was usually split along two lines, which have to do with the name, that basilicum, or basilium, I should say. Get sweaty. So there's one camp that basically believes that it's derived from Basilius, which is the Greek for king, okay? There's another camp, however, that believed that this name was derived from basilisk, and basilisk basically means the little king, because it was the king of serpents. So, basilisks, of course, were considered to be highly poisonous. So those who believed that the name of this plant was derived from basilisk tended to believe that this plant was highly poisonous in nature. Culpeper particularly fell into the poison camp. He actually wrote about how this plant is good for drawing out the bite, poison from the bite of poison serpents or insects, because sympathetic magic, like draws like. Basil is poisonous, therefore it's good at drawing poison. Culpeper, I mean, he's actually, in his book, he wrote about some stuff that reads just like all those urban legend forwarded emails that you would get from your great aunt, where it's like, some guy smelled basil and then he grew scorpions in his brain, that kind of shit. So, which is kind of ridiculous, but, so, we can use that though. If you're looking at the kingly etymology of this plant, then basically that means that this plant is really good for drawing wealth. Which is very common use for it. It's used in a lot of wealth and prosperity spells, success magic, that sort of thing. If you're looking at the poison etymology of this, though, it's good for drawing out poison, which would then be good for removing hexes, stopping arguments, stopping lovers' quarrels, that sort of thing, general clearing of bad vibes. Now, that's stopping lovers' quarrels. Basil is pretty widely used in a lot of current practitioners' love spells. That is one of the attributes that was given to this plant by Scott Cunningham, and a lot of people are using Scott Cunningham's works. But I want to say that specifically what Cunningham wrote about was that it's good for soothing tempers between lovers, which is, again, that drawing out poison aspect that I talked about. But also in, like, he writes of a love divination, where you throw the basil leaves on hot coals, and then if they hiss, then it shows that there's tension in a relationship. So again, that's more leaning towards that Mars, drawing out poison kind of aspect, than rather just like lovey-dovey love kind of stuff. Personally, a Mars-oriented, fire-oriented plant wouldn't be my first choice for a love spell, but if it works for you, you do you, okay? You just gotta make your own decisions on that. So, one last thing that Cunningham also mentioned about this plant is he makes a mention about witches drinking basil juice before they would fly to their Sabbath meets. I don't know where that reference particularly came from. Cunningham is the only one who mentions it. So, hey, why not? If you can probably try adding basil to a blend for astral travel or something like that. It certainly wouldn't hurt. why not? Give it a shot. So anyway, that's this lovely little plant here. Delicious little plant. Highly recommend growing it. It's very easy to grow in a pot on a windowsill. Just keep it warm and it'll be happy. And of course, like I said, the fresh leaves really are not a substitute. You know, they can't be substituted by the dried. You really need fresh basil for a lot of things, in particular that delicious, delicious pesto. So anyway, that's basil. So I hope this video finds you well. As always, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to add them. I'm usually responding if I'm not overwhelmed at work, so go for it. And of course, I'm gonna finally remembering to shill myself, so if you like this video, please subscribe and like, and that way I look good on the algorithm, so yay me. All right, cool. All right, that's done. Anyway, hope this video finds you well, and I will see you again soon.